Hello everyone and welcome back to my playlist of physiology which we are doing from Guyton. Today we are going to do chapter number 57 which talks about the motor control of these two important structures in our brain, which is the cerebellum and the basal ganglia. Now remember, the basal ganglia is all the accessory motor system, and we'll talk about cerebellum, how it interacts with different parts of your brain. So both of them basically, आपके brain में there are primary motor cortex area and then there are prefrontal and somatosensory areas and then accessory motor areas. So बहुत सारे motor areas आपके cerebral cortex में हैं, which actually are designed to initiate the movements, but they don't do this alone. They always do this in consultation with other parts of your nervous system. So for example, they talk to cerebellum, they talk to basal ganglia, they talk to midbrain, brainstem, and then only the output is finalized for a particular movement. So we'll talk about cerebellum and basal ganglia, that how they contribute to the overall motor control of your body. So in addition to the areas in the cerebral cortex that stimulate muscle contraction, two other brain structures are essential for normal motor activity, and these two important organs are cerebellum as well as basal ganglia. Neither of these structures can control the muscle function by themselves, so they are accessory, they are associated motor areas, but अकेले अगर cerebral cortex को निकाल दें, a term that we call the decerebrate animals में अगर ये experiment करें तो cerebellum हो और basal ganglia हो और cortex निकाल दिया जाए तो ये movement आपकी body की, यानी उन animals की body की ठीक से नहीं हो सकेगी. Okay, so it all works in concert. Cerebral cortex भी चाहिए और फिर ये भी चाहिए. Now, the cerebellum plays major role in timing of motor activity and in rapid, smooth progression from one muscle movement to the next. Extremely important role. अभी हम पढ़ेंगे इसके बारे में. It also helps to control the intensity of the muscle contraction. Number one is the timing. That is an important job of cerebellum. And number two is the intensity. कितना tightly close करना है muscle group को. Very, very important. Okay. On the other hand, the basal ganglia, they help to plan and control the complicated movements. Movements such as writing, such as throwing a basketball जब आप ground में खेल रहे. So it needs precision, so that sort of thing is and also movements associated with cognition. यानी मैं आगे चल के इस चैप्टर में एग्जांपल दूंगा कि सपोज इफ दिस इज यू स्टैंडिंग एंड देयर इज अ लाइन कमिंग टुवर्ड्स यू. अजीब सा लाइन बनाया, वैसे मैंने लिख ही देता हूँ, उससे अच्छा तो है. सो दैट लाइन इज कमिंग टुवर्ड्स यू, यू हैव टू डिसाइड दैट व्हाट यू नीड टू डू. दरख्त पर चढ़ना है, भागना है. यू नीड योर डिसीजन कैपेसिटी कोऑर्डिनेटेड विद योर मोटर कैपेसिटी. तो ये जो कोऑर्डिनेशन है बिटवीन थिंकिंग एंड मूवमेंट, दैट इज ऑल्सो द जॉब ऑफ बेसल गैंग्लिया. Okay, so complicated, complex, coordinated movements, basal ganglia, timing and intensity, cerebellum, right? Now let's begin with the cerebellum first and then we'll talk about basal ganglia. So cerebellum has long been called a silent area of the brain, principally because the excitation of the cerebellum does not cause any conscious sensation. So काफ़ी अच्छे तरीके समझा जाता था, शायद it does not perform important function. रिमूवल, वैसे आज भी हमें ब्रेन के कई सारे पार्ट्स का फंक्शन सही से नहीं पता. इनफैक्ट मैं बड़ी अथॉरिटी से कह रहा हूँ कि इवन cerebellum का भी पूरा फंक्शन नहीं पता होगा हमको. बट नाउ वी नो अ फ्यू बिट्स अबाउट cerebellum. लेकिन अगर रिमूवल ऑफ cerebellum एक्सपेरिमेंटल एनिमल्स में निकाल दिया जाए पूरा का पूरा cerebellum, what happens? Body movements become highly abnormal. Now this shows कि cerebellum कितना important है movements के लिए. The cerebellum is especially vital during rapid muscular activity such as running, typing, playing piano. You see, loss of this area of the brain, yani cerebellum, can cause almost total lack of coordination of all these activities defined. How can the cerebellum be so important but it has no direct ability to cause muscle contraction because it connects with different parts of the brain? The answer is that it helps sequence and monitor the motor activities and make corrective adjustments. Beautiful job done by cerebellum. The cerebellum receives continuously updated information about desired sequence of muscle contraction from the motor control area. So actually imagine the cerebral cortex communicating with cerebellum, giving it information. Okay, it also receives continuous sensory information from the peripheral parts of the body. So wow, it is getting information from the cerebral cortex as well as from peripheral parts of the body, and therefore it compares the actual movements as depicted with the movements intended by the motor system, and then it controls and fine tune कि movement ज़्यादा हो रही है तो उसे रोका जाए, कम हो रही है तो उसे बढ़ाया जाए, type of thing. Okay, the cerebellum also aids the cerebral cortex in planning the next sequence of movement a fraction of a second in advance while the current movement is still being performed. You see how important is this? So it's planning ahead ताकि वो movement continuous होती रहे. अगर आप इस तरह खड़े हुए हैं और आप 3 balls के साथ जगल कर रहे हैं, Oh, it is planning something, है ना. Also, it learns by making mistakes. So this is the machine learning concept. मैं हर जगह बात करता हूँ, इस चैप्टर में भी आगे चल के बात करूँगा about the machine learning. मशीन लर्निंग एल्गोरिदम और आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस एल्गोरिदम्स इस तरह काम करते हैं कि आप एक मशीन को जितना ज़्यादा डेटा देंगे उतना ज़्यादा वो मशीन सेल्फ लर्निंग प्रोसीजर से स्मार्ट हो जाएगी, एंड द प्रिडिक्शन ऑफ दैट मशीन विल बी इवन मच बेटर. सो इस तरह का सिस्टम आपके ब्रेन में ऑलरेडी इंस्टॉल्ड है. वन वेरी गुड एग्जाम्पल इज सेरिबेलम व्हिच लर्न्स बाय इट्स ओन मिस्टेक्स. सो नेक्स्ट टाइम यू परफॉर्म द मूवमेंट बेटर. इसीलिए कुछ ऐसे काम होते हैं जो कर करके आप सीख जाते हैं. ड्राइविंग है जैसे अच्छी राइटिंग आपके स्कूल्स में ज़्यादा लिखेंगे, प्रैक्टिस करेंगे, आपकी राइटिंग अच्छी होगी. बिल्कुल इसी तरह आप कोई भी गेम खेल रहे हैं, कराटे खेल रहे हैं, आपकी पर्टिकुलर मूवमेंट्स फाइन ट्यून हो जाती है. सो यू लर्न बाय मेकिंग स्पेसिफिक मूवमेंट्स. ओके, सो सेरिबेलम कैन सेल्फ learn. It's a beautiful system. Now there is long blue boxes which are basically talking about the anatomy of the cerebellum. So I'm going to skip those because न्यूरो एनाटमी की मैंने स्नेल से पूरी सीरीज करा रखी है. सेरिबेलम की एनाटमी पढ़ा दी है ऑलरेडी. तो एंटीरियर लोब क्या है, पोस्टीरियर क्या है, फ्लोकोनॉड्यूलर लोब क्या है, और उसके डिफरेंट कनेक्शंस विद द ब्रेन एंड डिफरेंट पाथवेज. ऑल दिस इज वी हैव डन. मैं लिंक दे देता हूँ, वरना जाके सर्च भी कर लो. मेरी न्यूरो एनाटमी की प्लेलिस्ट खोलो, स्नेल से मैंने करवाया है. उसमें सेरिबेलम का भाई पूरा स्ट्रक्चर मैंने करा दिया है. ठीक है. सो जितने भी afferent पाथवे हैं, इफरेंट पाथवेज हैं सेरिबेलम से एसोसिएटेड, वी हैव डन ऑल ऑफ देम इन ग्रेट डिटेल. ओके, आज मुझे फिजियोलॉजिकली जिस चीज़ पे फोकस करना है ना, वो है फंक्शनल यूनिट ऑफ द सेरिबेलम. के सेरिबेलम फिजियोलॉजिकली फंक्शनली कैसे काम करता है. सो अगर फंक्शनल यूनिट की हम बात करें, सो फंक्शनल यूनिट बेसिकली मीन्स कि व्हाट इज द बेसिक स्ट्रक्चर विद इन द सेरिबेलम व्हिच वर्क्स, और फिर उसको हम जनरलाइज कर सकें पूरे सेरिबेलम के फंक्शन पर. जैसे पूरी बॉडी का जो फंक्शनल यूनिट है, इट्स अ सेल. नाउ सेल हैज़ अ बेसिक स्ट्रक्चर कि जी सेल मेम्ब्रेन है, साइटोप्लाज्म है, न्यूक्लियस है, बट देन यू नो कि देयर आर स्पेशलिटीज एसोसिएटेड विद ईच एंड एवरी ऑर्गन. फॉर एग्जांपल लिवर के जो है पैरासाइट्स हैं, उनके अलग कैरेक्टरिस्टिक्स होंगे. ब्रेन में जो न्यूरोनल सेल्स हैं, दे आर डिफरेंट, बट बेसिकली दे आर ऑल सेल्स. ऐसे फंक्शनल यूनिट सेरिबेलम के जो हैं, देयर आर अबाउट 30 मिलियन. सो जस्ट इमेजिन हाउ बिग अ नंबर विद इन द सेरिबेलम exist for these functional units. So about 30 million functional units which are almost identical to each other, they exist within the cerebellum. और इसका स्ट्रक्चर ये है कि this functional unit centers on single very large Purkinje cell and on a corresponding deep nuclear cell. तो ये दो सेल के नाम आपने ना भूलने नहीं है कि पुरकंजी सेल्स और डीप न्यूक्लियर सेल पर सारे का सारा फंक्शन डिपेंड करता है. इस फंक्शनल यूनिट का भी हम देखते भी हैं, इसको समझेंगे डायग्राम में. दिस इज द फिगर दैट वी हैव टू स्पेंड सम टाइम ऑन. देयर आर 3 मेजर लेयर्स इन द सेरेब्रल कॉर्टेक्स जो इस फिगर में शो की गई हैं, मोलेकुलर, पुरकंजी एंड ग्रैनुलर. सो इफ यू सी हियर, these are the 3 layers which are shown here: molecular, Purkinje and granular. So this is all the cerebellar cortex. इन 3 layers को अभी अपने memories में fix कर दें, और थोड़ी देर में we will talk about it in more detail. Now these 3 layers के नीचे, beneath these cortical layers, in the center of the cerebellar mass are deep cerebellar nuclei that send output signals to other parts of the nervous system. So basically these are the deep nuclei, these are the cortical layers and these are the deep nuclei. और यहाँ से output निकलेगा. output का मतलब ये है कि cerebellum से निकलेगा and it will go to other parts of the brain. अब जो फंक्शनल यूनिट का न्यूरोनल सर्किट है ना, ये बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट है. जैसे सर्किट्स आर ऑलवेज इंपॉर्टेंट. अभी जब हम आगे बेसल गैंग्लिया की बात करेंगे तो विल टॉक अबाउट प्यूटामिन सर्किट, विल टॉक अबाउट कॉर्डेट सर्किट. सो ये सर्किट्स में आपको पता होना चाहिए कि कौन से न्यूरॉन्स इन्वॉल्व हैं, कहाँ से इनपुट आ रहा है, कहाँ आउटपुट जा रहा है. ओके, the neuronal circuit of the functional unit is repeated with little variation within the 30 million entities. They are almost similar. The output from the functional unit is from the deep nuclear cell. अब ये this is very interesting कि ये पूरा जो सर्किट है, इस सर्किट का जो आउटपुट है, यानी इस सर्किट से इंफॉर्मेशन प्रोसेस होकर जो बाहर निकल रही है, which is what we call the output, is via this single type of cell, which is the deep nuclear cell. It makes your life easy, okay? This cell is continuous under both excitatory as well as inhibitory influences. The excitatory influences arise from direct connection with the afferent fibers that enter the cerebellum from the brain and the periphery, and the inhibitory influences arises entirely from the Purkinje cells in the cortex of the cerebellum. So it can be excitatory input, it can be inhibitory input, but सारे का सारा जो output है, that is going through this particular type of cell, which is known as the deep nuclear cell. The afferent inputs to the cerebellum are mainly of two types. यानी अब हम बात ये कर रहे हैं कि cerebellum में कहाँ से inputs आ रहे हैं. Okay, input means things coming to the cerebellum. There are two types of neuronal fibers that you should know. One is known as a climbing fiber and the other one is known as the mossy fiber. अब आपको ये पता होना चाहिए climbing fibers usually कहाँ से आते हैं, mossy fibers कहाँ से आते हैं. Okay, the climbing fibers all originate from the inferior olives of the medulla. So they are coming from medulla, and there is one climbing fiber for about 5 to 10 Purkinje cells after sending branches. So this information you can actually skip, but the piece of information which is very important for you is the fact that cerebellum में input आ रहा है दो तरह के fibers से. So one set of fiber is known as the climbing fiber, the other one is mossy fiber. Climbing fibers are largely coming from medulla. और जो mossy fibers हैं, they enter the cerebellum actually from so many different sources. They come from the higher brain, they come from brainstem, they come from spinal cord as well. Okay. Mossy fiber input to Purkinje cell is quite different from the climbing fibers input because the synaptic connections are very weak. So large number of mossy fibers are usually much larger in number as compared to the climbing fibers. Okay, so that's an important piece of information जो मैं आपको segregate करके दे रहा हूँ जो आपने याद रखनी है. So if again look at this diagram. So these are the Purkinje fibers. Purkinje fibers are the major role player of a lot of input coming from different parts of the brain, and that input will either be in the form of climbing fibers or it will be in the form of mossy fibers which is there. Whatever input is coming, it will concentrate on the Purkinje cell and then to the output cell which is the deep nuclear cell. Okay, so ये circuit आपको basic structure of the circuit is a must remember. Now, Purkinje cells and the deep nuclear cells fire continuously even under normal resting condition because they have to maintain muscle tone, and ऐसा नहीं है कि they never go off. So throughout your life, these cells are continuously firing. Okay, balance between excitation and inhibition at the deep cerebellar nuclei. Now, referring again to the circuit, अभी आपको बताया था कि ये excitatory fibers भी हो सकते हैं, inhibitory भी हो सकते हैं. Note that the direct stimulation of the deep nuclear cells by both climbing and the mossy fiber excites them. By contrast, signals arriving from the Purkinje cells inhibit them. So if you look at the diagram, so this is the mossy fiber. It is going towards the deep nuclear, exciting it. Positive signal. This is the climbing fiber. If it directly communicates with the deep nuclear cell, it excites it. लेकिन अगर ये Purkinje के through message जाता है, so it basically inhibits it. So there is a balance between when to excite, when to inhibit type of thing. Okay? और उस inhibition को हम relay या damping कहते हैं. Now, basket cells or stellate cells, they cause lateral inhibition of the Purkinje cells in the cerebellum. Now, in addition to deep nuclear cells, granule cells, Purkinje cells, two other type of cells are also present, which are called the basket cells and the stellate cells, which are inhibitory cells with short axons. So basically, ये भी they are also trying to. The point is that this is the output. So इस output को inhibit करने के लिए there are so many different structures available, and the whole purpose is to find out a nice balance between the movement. ठीक है? इससे ज़्यादा details पता भी नहीं है. Now the turn on, turn off, and turn off and turn on output signals from the cerebellum. Now typical function of the cerebellum is to help provide rapid turn on signals, यानी जल्दी से movement start हो for agonist muscles and simultaneous reciprocal turn off signals for antagonistic. आपको पता है पूरी antagonistic muscle की theory कि if this is your arm, यहाँ पे biceps हैं, if they have to contract, then the triceps which are present at the back of the forearm and arm, ये tricep वाला region पे relax होना होगा, तभी इसे कहते हैं antagonistic. One side of the muscle contract, the other side of the muscle relax. And this is done by cerebellum very nicely. Okay, so ये सारी details is basically the same thing. You don't want to worry about the whole lot of text written here. Just pick up for this particular section of this chapter. I would say just pick up the heading. You should know what the heading means, and you should have the basic concept about it. Okay. डिफरेंट सेल्स कौन से हैं, सर्किट वाली डायग्राम इज सुपर डुपर इंपॉर्टेंट. यू शुड नो कि आउटपुट कौन से सेल से हो रहा है. Purkinje फाइबर का इनिबिटरी रोल है, लेटरल इनिबिशन किन चीज़ों से हो रही है. ऑल दीज mossy fiber, climbing fiber, the important things I'm paying special attention to, but that does not mean you have to read the whole test and get yourself bored. अच्छा जी, Purkinje cells learn to correct the motor errors and there is a role of climbing fibers. So again, this is preliminary research जिससे हमको ये पता लगा है कि जो Purkinje cells हैं, they have a self-learning capacity, और उस self-learning capacity में climbing fibers help them to learn from their mistakes. But the degree to which cerebellum supports the onset and offset of muscle contraction as well as timing to contraction must be learned by the cerebellum. Typically, when a person first performs a new motor activity, the degree of motor enhancement by the cerebellum at the onset of contraction, the degree of... इसको आप ऐसे लें कि if you start driving a car, what happens? You are very super cautious, आप बड़े आराम से steering घुमाने का सोचते हैं and all these things. You're very, very careful. But after like 10 years of driving, it becomes your reflex. So initially, your cerebellum was learning and storing the memory within the cortex or... by using very complex communication systems also with other parts of the brain, it becomes your reflex, and now you have learned. So it is believed that the cells involved in this learning process within the cerebellum are the Purkinje cell, but they require input from the clamping cells. इससे ज़्यादा मालूम ही नहीं है, ठीक है? So we don't know more than that. How does that happen? Function of the cerebellum in overall motor control. Now, that's an important summary heading. The nervous system uses cerebellum to coordinate motor control functions at 3 different levels. Number 1 is the vestibulocerebellum. This level consists principally of a small flocconodular cerebellar lobes that lie under the posterior cerebellum. Anatomical details. It provides neuronal circuits for most of the body's equilibrium movement. So that is one important thing. Other level of coordination is the spinocerebellum. This level consists most of the vermis, and this part is important for movements of the distal portions of the limbs and hands and fingers. Okay, and third important feature of cerebellum is the cerebellocerebellum, where it is communicating with the cerebellum. It consists of the lateral zones of the cerebellar hemispheres. अब इस जोन की इंपॉर्टेंस क्या है? इस जोन का खास है कि it provides output to in terms of information in the upward direction back to the brain. So it is communicating with the brain again, functioning as a feedback manner with the cerebral cortex to control the limb movements. Okay, so these 3 important levels of control by cerebellum are important for you to remember. Then I would recommend कि ये सारी details आपको omit की जा सकती हैं कि अब now what they have basically done is how does the vestibulocerebellum function to control equilibrium, how does the spinocerebellum, but that is not basically required. So if you understand the whole basic stuff that we have discussed, that suffice for the discussion on cerebellum, and you can easily omit all these headings, right? Including this one. I would just jump on to now the next. This one is partially important. You should know that planning of a sequential movements is in part controlled by the cerebellum. So the planning of sequential movement requires the lateral zones of the hemispheres, cerebellar hemisphere की बात हो रही है, communicate with both the premotor and the sensory portion of the cerebral cortex, and it requires two-way communication so that you can plan. So basically what they're telling you is that this is your cortex and this is your cerebellum. There has to be a communication established if you have to plan a movement. अब मुझे बताएं ये पढ़ के आपने क्या सीखा? I mean, this is something very, very common sense, okay? So nothing fancy here. So this is all okay. You can leave these things. And the next important heading is the basal ganglia. So let's start on basal ganglia. Cerebellum में जितनी बातें बताई हैं बॉस ये याद रखनी है. और physiology में देखें, having a mentor helps you to identify what is the text that is low yield and what is the text that is high yield. You can still read it, but to me this is not high yield. So let's move on to the next heading, which is basal ganglia ka control of the motor functions. Let us now start discussing the circuits associated with basal ganglia. और जैसे मैं पिछली वीडियो में गाइड करता रहा हूँ बार बार जब हम न्यूरोफिजियोलॉजी कर रहे हैं, तो फर्स्ट थिंग इज टू गो टू न्यूरो एनाटॉमी जो मैंने स्नेल से कराई है, और वहाँ पूरा एक चैप्टर है बेसल गैंग्लिया पे, उसको ज़रूर पढ़िएगा, ठीक है. फिजियोलॉजिकली व्हाट यू हैव टू रिमेंबर कि basal ganglia is an accessory motor system which works with the cerebral cortex and obviously the corticospinal motor system. So you know the orientation. Okay, we have the cerebral cortex and then the spinal cord, and then from the primary and the other accessory motor areas of the cerebral cortex, there are fibers coming down to the spinal cord, which is what we call the corticospinal tract. तो ये जो basal ganglia का apparatus है, it not only coordinates with the cerebral cortex but also coordinates with the corticospinal motor system. Corticospinal tracts के साथ भी ये interact करता है, okay? So first thing, you should know what exactly basal ganglia mean. It is on each side of the brain. These ganglia contains caudate nucleus, putamen, globus pallidus, substantia nigra, and also associated with them are the subthalamic nuclei. तो anatomically आपको इसकी orientation तो सबसे पहले पता ही होनी चाहिए, and then we will talk about कि कौन कौन से pathways हैं. ठीक है. मेजर जो masses है बेसल गैंग्लिया का, या जो मेजर पाथवेज आप कह लें, दे आर लार्जली डिवाइडेड इनटू टू सर्किट्स, एंड दो सर्किट्स आर नेम्ड समवेयर. दे आर कॉल्ड putamen सर्किट एंड द अदर सर्किट इज कॉल्ड द कॉर्डेट सर्किट. अभी इसकी डिटेल्स हमने देखनी है. ठीक है. दिस इज व्हाट वी हैव टू डिस्कस. सो इफ यू लुक हियर, दिस इज वेयर right in the middle, in the center, deep down, you have those basal ganglia, and if you see their, cartoon, then you see there is a caudate nucleus, putamen, globus pallidus, subthalamic nuclei, and they coordinate quite well with a lot of motor areas in the cerebral cortex, and they also coordinate with the corticospinal tracts. दो largely हम tracts की बात करेंगे. One is called the putamen circuit. There we will see how the cerebral cortex area is coordinating its moves with the basal ganglia. तो एक putamen circuit हमने study करना है, and the other circuit that we have to study is the caudate circuit. ठीक है. दोनों के बारे में बात करेंगे कि what they are and how do they basically behave. Okay. So let's first start discussing the putamen circuit. One of the principal roles of the basal ganglia in motor control is to function in association with the corticospinal system to control the complex patterns of motor activity. So it is basically coordinating with the higher centers of the cerebral cortex and the corticospinal tracts. और ये basically इन्होंने जो example यहाँ दी है, that is writing an alphabet. When the basal ganglia sustains serious damage, the cortical system of motor control can no longer provide these particular patterns. Instead, one's writing become crude, as if one were learning how to write at the first time. जैसे बच्चों का होता है ना, ए लिखने को बोलो तो ऐसा ऐसा टेढ़ा मेढ़ा ए लिखते हैं, आप बोले तो ऐसा खूबसूरत ए लिखेंगे, कैपिटल ए लिखना है तो ऐसा लिखेंगे, है ना. लेकिन अगर बेसल गैंग्लिया डिस्टर्ब है तो आप भी ऐसा ही टेढ़ा मेढ़ा ए शायद बनाना शुरू कर दें. Other patterns that require the basal ganglia are cutting paper with scissors. This is another example. Hammering nails, shooting the basketball through the hoop. So these are all skilled movements, coordinated movements, जहाँ cerebral cortex तो काम करता ही है, but the input from basal ganglia is also very important. Okay. Now, putamen circuit जिसकी अभी हम बात कर रहे हैं, उसके आपको पूरा साइकिल पता होना चाहिए कि from where it is initiated. So they usually begin the putamen circuit in the premotor and the supplementary areas of the motor cortex. यहाँ से fibers निकलते हैं also in the somatosensory areas of the cerebral cortex, and then they pass to the putamen, then to the globus pallidus, and then it goes next to the ventroanterior and ventrolateral relay nuclei, which are present in thalamus, and they return back to the cerebral cortex, and this time they come back to the primary cortex area, motor cortex area. So if you look at this diagram, now this is the primary motor cortex area, and these are the premotor and the prefrontal area. So basically somatosensory, ये somatosensory area है, the premotor and supplementary area, and also the prefrontal areas. In areas से आप देख रहे हैं, these are the descending fibers which are going towards the putamen. Putamen से then the fibers goes next to the globus pallidus, और globus pallidus से thalamus, और thalamus से अब fibers वापस जा रहे हैं. Now when they are going back, they are going also to the premotor area, but mainly to the primary cortex area, जो कि motor facilities के साथ या motor हमारी activities के साथ associated है. So it's kind of a loop कि the message is starting in the cerebral cortex. So it is starting in these regions, coming to the basal ganglia, relaying in the thalamus, and going back to the main motor area. So ये circuit कहलाता है. This is called the putamen circuit. और मैंने आपको बताया है कि ये सारे जो भी एग्जाम्पल्स हमने देखी थी, लिखना, पेपर पे राइटिंग, सीजर्स का यूज, हैमरिंग द नेल्स, बास्केटबॉल, all these are the movements which are the movements which require intact putamen circuit. Okay, so the putamen circuit has its input mainly from, कहाँ से इनपुट आ रहा है इसका, फ्रॉम डिफरेंट पार्ट्स ऑफ द ब्रेन विच आर एडजेसेंट टू द प्राइमरी मोटर कॉर्टेक्स एरिया. जैसे प्रीफ्रंटल एरिया है, सोमैटोसेंसरी एरिया है, लेकिन इट इज गोइंग बैक, इसका जो आउटपुट है दैट इज गोइंग बैक टू द प्राइमरी मोटर कॉर्टेक्स एरिया. दैट इज द थिंग टू रिमेंबर. अब ऑब्वियसली ये इनपुट और आउटपुट के जो वर्ड्स हैं ये आपको इस तरह समझने हैं कि सी दिस इज वेयर वी आर टॉकिंग अबाउट कि दिस इज द बेसल गैंग्लिया. सो बेसल गैंग्लिया में जो फाइबर्स आ रहे हैं, दिस इज कॉल्ड द इनपुट फाइबर्स, इनपुट टू द बेसल गैंग्लिया. और बेसल ganglia से जो fibers जा रहे हैं, these are called the output fibers, output from the basal ganglia. So the input is coming from premotor, supplemental and somatosensory area, and the output is going primarily to the primary motor cortex area. That's the super important thing that you have to remember. Okay, and if putamen is not working fine, then आपकी जो movements हैं, they go all here and there. So अगर putamen circuit सही काम नहीं कर रहा, so there can be, for example, athetosis, which are rhythmic movements, जिसमें continuous rhythmic movements होती हैं hand की, upper neck की या face की region की, a term which we call athetosis. Similarly, if there is a lesion in subthalamus, often leads to flailing movements of the entire limb, a condition called hemiballismus. Also, if there are problems within putamen, it leads to flicking movements of the hands and the face and other parts of the body, which is now known as chorea. Now, obviously, there are differences between chorea and athetosis, which we have discussed in detail in neuroanatomy. Lesions of the substantia nigra leads to the common and extremely severe disease rigidity, akinesia, Parkinson. So, ये जो basal ganglia है, they are very important clinically. इनका coordination with the cortex is super important. Otherwise, if there is problem in putamen, globus pallidus, thalamus, all these diseases will develop. Okay. The next important circuit that you have to remember with respect to the basal ganglia is the caudate circuit. और caudate circuit के जब भी आपका C for caudate and C for cognition. So remember, caudate is important for cognitive thinking, cognitive control of the motor activity. So suppose, for example, you are standing here and suddenly comes a lion towards you. So you should be able to think, okay, this lion is dangerous for me and I should now either be running or doing something to move so that the lion does not harm me. ये जो cognitive control है, thinking capacity, जो motor function के साथ associated है, यानी movement के साथ thinking capacity जो associated है, that is by and large the job of the caudate circuit. Okay, so that's very important for you to remember. And again, the circuit आपको पता होना चाहिए caudate circuit का क्या है, and that is very interesting because जो input आ रहा है, अब again these are the basal ganglia, और यहाँ जो input आ रहा है, the input is now coming from primary motor. This is different as compared to the putamen circuit. Putamen circuit में input was not coming from the primary motor cortex area, it was coming from the prefrontal and the somatosensory. तो यहाँ somatosensory से भी input आ रहा है, premotor से भी आ रहा है, but also coming from the primary motor area. And then the output is not going to the primary motor area, it is going to other parts of the brain. Okay, so that's the output. That's the difference. So signals initiate in different areas of the brain, primarily in the primary motor cortex area. From the cerebral cortex, they pass to the caudate nucleus and then to the globus pallidus. Then they go to the thalamus and finally go back to the prefrontal, premotor, supplementary motor areas of the cortex brain. So input and then output. So ये जो दो circuits हैं basal ganglia के, एक putamen circuit and the other one which is called the caudate circuit, they have different input and different output, and therefore they are important for different types of movements. ठीक है, यहाँ इन्होंने एग्जाम्पल दी भी है लाइन वाली कि if the line approaches you, you have to turn, you have to run or climb a tree, you have to decide. So thinking is associated with movement, and that sort of thing is the job of this particular caudate circuit of the basal ganglia. Okay, now function of the basal ganglia to change the timing and to scale the intensity. So taken together, it is very important कि आपको ये पता हो कि basal ganglia. So say for example, if you are given a piece of paper and I ask you to write A, you can write A like this, you can write A like this, you can write A small or large. So that particular decision कि how much you have to write, how huge you have to write, is to determine कि आपकी मूवमेंट का स्कोप क्या है, मूवमेंट होगी कैसी, हाउ द मूवमेंट विल बी एंड हाउ स्ट्रांगली विल इट बी परफॉर्म्ड. एक ही एग्जांपल इन्होंने यहाँ पे दी है, वही मैं एक्सप्लेन कर रहा था. सो if the basal ganglia is working fine, then you will be in good control of your movement. But if the basal ganglia is not working fine, see what happens. So this is the actual drawing. You ask a person to draw something like this and you draw something absolutely out of context. See, इनका spacing different हो गई, यहाँ spacing different हो गई. गोल दायरा तो खैर मुझसे भी ठीक नहीं बनता कभी भी, ये देखो खुला रह गया थोड़ा सा. But you see, ये सेंटर में होना चाहिए था ये पॉइंट कहाँ पर है. So the picture is actually completely out of proportion. इसी तरह अगर आप ये डायग्राम देखें, you ask the person to draw the diagram and you get this. यहाँ पे 2 लीव्स थे, यहाँ पे सिर्फ एक बनाया हुआ है, इतने सारे पेटल्स हैं, यहाँ पे इस तरह पेटल बनाए, उनका स्पेसिंग देखें. So it is absolutely out of proportion. These types of things happen when the basal ganglia are damaged, and this is they have specific names obviously, such as personal neglect syndrome. So remember that your basal ganglia are super important for coordinated skills movements, right? अच्छा, अब आपको कुछ at the end of this particular section you need to remember some neurotransmitters. So for example, dopamine है, it is particularly associated with all those pathways which are involving substantia nigra. So substantia nigra से जो caudate nucleus के साथ pathways हैं, these are all the dopamine releasing cells. And you also have to remember that some of them, particularly dopamine and GABA, they are inhibitory neurons. Okay, they are inhibitory neurotransmitters. So GABA is another way. It is released from the neurons which are involved in the pathway from the caudate nucleus to the putamen to the globus pallidus and substantia nigra. So remember these two. Acetylcholine pathways from cortex to the caudate nucleus and putamen, यानी cortex से जो भी pathways इस तरफ आ रहे हैं towards the basal ganglia, they will be utilizing acetylcholine as the neurotransmitter. Okay, this is very complex. There are so many others as well which are associated with brainstem, and they include norepinephrine and caphlins and whatnot. Remember, it is a very, very complicated circuitry, but we are explaining only the bit that we know, right? GABA and dopamine. These two, you have to remember, are inhibitory neurotransmitters. So wherever they are released, the message will be inhibited. Okay, I'm not doing the clinical stuff because इसका अलग से हम aim कर रहे हैं कि जो physio में blue boxes हैं, we'll discuss them separately. Right? So that's all about the particular section on the basal ganglia and their association with different movement pathways and the details. Now we have to talk about the integration, okay, how different parts of the brain integrate with each other in controlling. So after all the discussion, now it's I think worth spending a few minutes to discuss the integration of many parts of the total motor control system. You know, we have in the previous chapters discussed several times that there is a motor control of our voluntary and motor activities by spinal cord, by cerebral cortex, by brainstem. And in this chapter, we talked about cerebellum and also the basal ganglia. Now, all these, they are not working in, individuality. So they all work in concert. And this is now the time that we will talk about the integration of different steps, how this is done. Different parts of the central nervous system, they integrate with each other. So finally, we will summarize best as we can what is known about the overall control of the movement. So that's a very important statement because we know very little. To do this, let us first give a synopsis of different levels of control. So what does that basically mean? कि एक brief summary आपको याद दिलाएंगे कि जी spinal cord के level पे क्या हुआ था, hindbrain के level पे क्या हुआ, motor cortex level पे क्या हो रहा है, cerebral cortex की बात हो रही है, and then obviously we'll talk about how they are all integrated. So spinal cord के level पर programmed in the spinal cord are local patterns, जिसको हम reflexes कहते हैं. So body के जो withdrawal reflexes हैं, they are largely planned at the level of spinal cord. The cord is locus also of complex patterns of rhythmic motions such as to and from movements of the limb for walking activity. So this is again kind of an involuntary act. जब आप चल रहे होते हो, so if I ask you, okay, do you really plan to raise your right leg and move it forward and then the left leg? No, you kind of involuntarily do this. So एक चीज जो spinal cord के level पे हो रही है, that is the reflexes. The other thing which is happening at the level of spinal cord is the movement for walking, plus the reciprocal motion on the opposite side of the body of the hind limbs versus the forelimbs in the four-leg animals. जिस तरह four-leg animals में हमारे पास ज़ाहिर walking है, जब वॉकिंग आप करते हो तो पैटर्न वही है, आपके लोअर लिम्ब भी मूव कर रहे होते हैं, साथ साथ आपके अपर लिम्ब भी टंग 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 आगे पीछे मूव कर रहे होते हैं. आई एम श्योर यू मस्ट हैव नोटिस्ड दिस. All these programs of the cord can be commanded into actions by higher levels of the motor control, or they can be inhibited while the higher levels take over the control. So spinal cord में जो initiate हो रही हैं हमारी body की voluntary movements, उनमें major जो आपने याद रखने हैं, I mean this is kind of involuntary reflex. यानी अगर आपका हाथ पे कोई पिन चुभ हो दे, ये हमने डिटेल में से पूरा एक चैप्टर था, we have discussed this in detail. But now is the synopsis, the summary of what happens at the spinal cord level. So reflexes and walking movements, okay? But having said this, they are saying that this is not only done and controlled by the spinal cord. There are cerebral hemisphere और cerebral cortex का control भी होता है इन movements पर. Hind brain के level पर दो major functions हैं. One is the maintenance of axial tone for the purpose of standing, so maintaining the posture. And the second one is continuous modification of the degree of the tone in different muscles in response to the information that it gets via the sensory input. So muscle spindle fiber है, Golgi tendon apparatus है, उसकी base पर किस muscle का कितना body में tone रखना है. So these two things are being controlled at the level of the hind brain. Then there is a motor cortex, which is the higher center. It provides most of the activating motor signals to the spinal cord. It functions partly by issuing sequential and parallel commands that set into motion various chord patterns of motor action. So basically ये अगर मैं इस पूरे पैराग्राफ को आपको summarize करूँ, so your cerebral cortex is the master regulator. It basically drives everything. अब तक आपने कई दफ़ा हमने इस पे cerebral cortex पे already एक chapter पूरा किया हुआ है कि how does it control the voluntary movement. So it basically gives messages to all different parts of the central nervous system and control the movements. Okay, and they are very complex. It's not something very simple. And the voluntary movements can be learned. So एक चीज़ होती है आजकल बहुत ज़्यादा उसका शोर होगा चल रहा है, वो कहलाती है मशीन लर्निंग, या आसान ज़बान में अगर बिल्कुल आपसे कहूँ, ऑल्दो इट्स अ डिफरेंट थिंग विच इज़ आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस, लेकिन ज़्यादातर लोग इसको पहचानते हैं आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस को. मशीन लर्निंग बहुत से लोगों के लिए नया वर्ड होता है, बट दैट्स kind of very interesting new discipline which is emerging बहुत सारी fields में और medicine में भी, कि there are machine algorithms which can which have the capacity of self learning. जितना ज़्यादा उनको डेटा प्रोवाइड किया जाता है उतने वो स्मार्ट होते जाते हैं. दैट इज़ व्हाट इज़ नॉन एज मशीन लर्निंग एल्गोरिथम्स. तो आपके ब्रेन में ये एल्गोरिथम्स टाइप ऑफ चीज़ें फिट हैं ऑलरेडी. सो योर ब्रेन लर्न्स विद आपने पहले भी सेरेब्रल कॉर्टेक्स में भी हम ये बात कर चुके हैं, और इस चैप्टर में भी हमने बात की है कि योर कंट्रोल ऑफ द मूवमेंट गेट्स बेटर विद द पैसेज ऑफ टाइम बिकॉज यू लर्न विद योर मूवमेंट्स. ओके, स्किल्ड मूवमेंट्स है ना, जैसे आप ड्राइविंग कर रहे हैं, सो यू लर्न इट बेटर. जितना ज़्यादा ड्राइव करेंगे उतना आपकी मूवमेंट अच्छी होगी. इफ देयर इज अ सर्जन परफॉर्मिंग सर्जरी, जितना ज़्यादा आप सर्जरी करेंगे उतना आपका हाथ क्लियर, स्पीड, फाइन, स्किल्ड मूवमेंट अच्छी होती है. सो यू हैव अ मशीन लर्निंग एल्गोरिथम फिटेड इन योर ब्रेन. दुनिया आज इसके बारे में बात कर रही है, एंड जब से ह्यूमन बना है दे आर गिवन दिस ब्यूटीफुल ब्रेन विच हैज़ द कैपेसिटी ऑफ सेल्फ लर्निंग. नाउ associated functions of cerebellum, the cerebellum function with all levels of muscle control. जब ये कहते हैं कि all levels of muscle control, so what basically this means is spinal cord and cerebral cortex and other parts of the central nervous system. It functions with the spinal cord especially to enhance the stretch reflex, या withdrawal reflex. At the brainstem level, cerebellum function to make postural movements of the body. So it is also communicating with the brainstem level. It is also communicating with the cerebral cortex level. यहाँ पे cerebellum operates in association with the cortex to provide many necessary motor functions, especially to provide extra motor force for turning on muscle contraction. So basically cerebellum is communicating with all different parts of the brain. That's what is the bottom line of this particular paragraph. The cerebral functions mainly when rapid muscle movements are required. So that's an important point. Without cerebellum, slow and calculative movements can still occur because your cerebral cortex is working, and this is where the slow and coordinated movements are initiated. But if you have to do some rapid action, this is where you need cerebellum. Okay, very, very important concept. Associated functions of the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia are essential to motor control in ways entirely different from those of cerebellum. Obviously, बिल्कुल different, इनके mechanics ही अलग है. Their most important functions are to help the cortex execute subconscious, learned patterns of movements. So they are being operated at the level of subconscious stage. So you are not consciously thinking about it, but you have learned it over the period of time. हम कहते हैं ना, ओ यार ये तो जब बैटिंग कर रहे हैं तो ये कवर ड्राइव पे शॉट खेलना तो फलाने बंदे का रिफ्लेक्स बना हुआ है. So this is where the basal ganglia are coordinating with the cerebral cortex. It also helps plan multiple parallel sequential patterns of movements that puts the movement जिसमें mind जो है it puts together to accomplish a purposeful task. So बहुत से लोग होता है, आपने देखा वो if you are one of those guys जो 3 balls के साथ जगल कर सकते हैं या 4 balls के साथ जगल कर सकते हैं. So that's a kind of movement जिसमें आपको multiple order repeat करना है to perform the task successfully. And this is where also the basal ganglia is very important. The type of motor pattern that require the basal ganglia include those for writing all the different letters of the alphabet, for throwing a ball, for typing. These are all the movements जिसमें basal ganglia involved. So these are some examples of what they just talked about here. At a still higher level of control is another combined cerebral and basal ganglia circuit, beginning in the thinking process of the cerebellum to provide overall sequential step for action for responding to each new situation, such as planning one's immediate motor response to an assailant or one's sequential response to unexpectedly, somebody found embarrassed. So बात सारी ये है कि आपके जो सडन रिस्पॉन्सेस हैं जिसमें आपके दिमाग में कुछ चल रहा होता है कि मैं ये करूंगा, सो ये जो सेरिब्रल कॉर्टेक्स का थिंकिंग वाला लूप इन्वॉल्व हो गया, दैट देन ऑल्सो हैज टू टॉक टू बेसल गैंग्लिया इन ऑर्डर टू एग्जीक्यूट द मूवमेंट. ओके, देन व्हाट ड्राइव्स अस टू एक्शन? What is it that arouses us from the inactivity and sets into play our trains of movement? So आप कुर्सी पे बैठे हुए हैं. So what is it that actually asks you to stand up and do the movement? We are beginning to learn about the motivational system of the brain. So we are beginning. देखिए, मैं हर वक्त जब कहता हूँ कि हमें नर्वस सिस्टम के बारे में बहुत ज़्यादा पता नहीं, इट्स अ वेरी कॉम्प्लिकेटेड सिस्टम, तो अक्सर लोग मुझ पर बड़ा एतराज़ करते हैं. Now what about this? गाइटन भी यही बात कर रहा है. So we are beginning to learn. हमारी अंडरस्टैंडिंग about how the working of nervous system is designed is actually very, very naive in the neonatal stage. Okay, so basically the brain has an older core located beneath, anterior and lateral to the thalamus, including the hypothalamus, amygdala, hippocampus, septal regions anterior to the hypothalamus. So this sara region is considered as the core. All of these function together to initiate most of the motor functions of the body, and these areas are collectively something which we call the limbic system. और ये जो लिम्बिक सिस्टम है, it is believed that this is associated with moves to start the action. But anyways, as I like this line, beautifully written, that we are only beginning to learn about the motivational system. So it's our very beginning, right? So very complicated system. So all the very best. फिर मुलाकात होती है अगली वीडियो में. तब तक के लिए अपना ख्याल रखिएगा.